Hi, my name is Arati Ganeshan, and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the research presentations for the 2021-2022 cohort of the Meta India Tech Scholars. Meta launched the program to provide a research and mentorship platform to law students who are keen to engage on contemporary questions of technology, law, and policy. The law firm Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas Co is supporting the program as a knowledge partner. Through this series, the scholars will show us how specific policy choices in the technology sector influence and impact India's tryst with the internet. Today, we have Jade Lyngdoh with us. Jade is currently at the National Law University, Jodhpur, where he has been a Meta India Tech Scholar. His work focuses on the intersection of technology, law and policy, and human rights. Jade writes columns for publications including Hindustan Times, The Telegraph, The Wire, and The Quint. I'm delighted to have you here, Jade, and I look forward to hearing about how you've approached content moderation in India and across the world.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jade Jeremiah Lyngdoh. I'm currently in my final year of studies at National University in Jodhpur. Um, I was assigned to SFLC.in for the duration of the 2021-2022 Meta India Tech Scholars Program. So today I will be presenting a research paper that I worked on as part of the MITS research program. Content moderation using local languages, lessons for social media platforms in India is the title of the paper that I'm presenting today. Yeah. So during the course of the research program, I kind of thought about uh, the role that local and less spoken languages play in content moderation, and I specifically wanted to understand if using these languages could help to ensure that content moderation processes adhere to an adequate standard of freedom of speech and expression. Um, going on ahead, it's important to consider why I chose this topic. To explain this better, I'd like to use a simple example to help you understand this. I belong to the Khasi tribe from the Indian state of Meghalaya. My tribe speaks Khasi, and many people use it to communicate on social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Right, and early on, a question which popped up in my mind was whether a social media platform, say Facebook or Twitter, would be able to detect and understand whether, say, for instance, a comment was posted in Kasi, whether it violates a platform's rules. If someone posted a comment which to an indigenous Kasi speaker would constitute hate speech. So this really seemed like an interesting question, which I felt would be great to explore. And to conduct my research, I chose to follow the qualitative method of research. And in order to conduct this research, I used observational case studies and an analysis of existing literature on the subject matter. And given the sensitivity of the subject matter of content moderation, I decided to follow these two methods of research due to the limitations in collecting primary data. This is something I will speak more about later in the presentation. But to make this easy to understand, we realize that in most instances, social media platforms are wary of revealing confidential internal company policies in public domain. So, to ensure that the purpose of my research was met, I found that in the alternative, the use of case studies and analysis of existing literature on the subject was a useful approach to adopt. Um, to begin with, looking into the findings of my research paper, we could try and look at a case study, one of the case studies which I used during my research. This case study will help us understand the importance of using local and lesser spoken languages in content moderation. So, the use of this particular case study really helps to illustrate, and this was a case study from Myanmar, and this helps illustrate two difficulties in content moderation, and both of these are linked to each other. When we look at the case study, what we realize is that the first problem that it presented was that it showed the importance of understanding the context behind a post. This includes linguistic as well as the cultural background behind a post before a content moderator takes a decision on that reported or flagged content based on the platform rules. And this is something which platforms including Meta, Facebook, and Instagram, and Twitter have agreed on. And they've stressed that the relevant context behind any post is critical in understanding whether the content in question violates platform rules and, in some circumstances, also domestic law. The second issue which this case study from Myanmar raises is that the necessity for platforms to support more languages in their content moderation operations. So this second point is important because in order for a content moderator to really understand the general meaning behind a post which is flagged or reported, the content moderator must first, the content moderation operation must first support the language in which the post in question is published. So, if the content moderation operation doesn't enable this, the content moderator's capacity to truly comprehend the significance of the post in question will be limited. Going ahead, what do we understand from this? So when we look at our key findings, I realized that my research showed that uh, currently social media platforms moderate content in several languages across the globe. Twitter, for instance, notes that it moderates content in multiple languages, which is led by a 24/7 cross-functional international team, whereas Meta, which includes platforms like Facebook and Instagram, has content review teams which support 70 languages across the globe. While my research was unable to gather information on the number of Indian languages which Twitter currently moderates content in, it shows that Meta moderates content in 21 languages in India. While this number might seem impressive at first, it's important to consider the context in which social media platforms operate in India. Uh, we currently have close to about 121 major spoken languages in the country itself. So, when we look at the number of languages which are currently supported in content moderation operations, in the context of this huge figure, it shows that there's a lot of room for improvement for social media platforms. What Another key finding which we take away from the case study is that while my research shows that when content is being moderated, it's critical for social media platforms to support these languages, these lesser and spoken languages in which the posts are published in. This, as I've noted, this is a point which social media platforms have noted is important. And when we've also seen what could happen when these content moderation operations don't support these languages. Uh, it's we've My research showed that the use of these languages in content moderation operations often increases the efficiency of content moderation processes. And to understand how this really impacts the efficiency of content moderation operations, my research relied on a case study which which was based on a case from the oversight board, and one of these case studies looked at how in India, when Facebook didn't translate its internal implementation guidelines, which content moderators use, into the Punjabi language, this led to an impact on the content moderator's ability to effectively apply the platform's rules. Going ahead, we'll look at another case study, which we look at another case study which delves on another point which came up in my research, and this shows some interesting points which gives us an insight into the effectiveness of automated tools in content moderation. And uh, of course, we've seen a lot of platforms have tried to suggest that automated tools are the way forward in content moderation, given the scale at which these operations work on. So, when we look at this case study, this was based on an oversight board case from Ethiopia. And looking at the case study, the post in the case study referred to above was actually flagged by Facebook's automated tools for potentially violating Facebook's policies. And what happens is that the case notes here that the way that this post in question was flagged was by a process which rhythmic content, which is the language in which the content we're talking about was published in, was flagged with both low and high potential match scores, and these content were actually sampled and enqueued for human review to which would eventually improve the performance of these automated tools. And as part of this process, it appears that the post in question was flagged for review by a content moderator. However, because of the complexity of these automated tools, it appears that the automated tools were unable to automatically take down the content which had violated Facebook's rules. And the process to take down the content in question was eventually involved the use of two separate content moderators who were Amharic speakers, and these moderators had based their content moderation decisions based on their expertise and understanding of the local language. So this kind of highlights that the automated tools were ineffective at moderating content without additional human review. So, what do we take from this case study? We realize that while Meta has noted that 97% of the posts which constitute hate speech on its platforms were detected by AI systems, my research showed that social media platforms have admitted that these kind of automated tools have their limitations. We've noted just now, for instance, how due to the technological complexity of these tools, they appear to only function in closely related languages. And to fill such gaps, social media platforms often employ social staff members and third party entities to moderate content. So, uh, going ahead, uh, going ahead, we have some summary findings which are based on my research paper. And uh, going ahead, we realize that first and foremost, social media platforms must be transparent about the way they enforce their content moderation policies. Being transparent about these policies, which often affect the rights of individuals across the globe, will ensure that companies, researchers, and policymakers are able to effectively work on solutions to existing and future problems posed by content moderation. Simply put, it's important to understand that we can't solve the problems posed by platforms if we do not, at the first instance, understand the extent of these problems. So platforms also have to take important steps to improve the support for these languages. They should try and ensure that their internal content moderation guidelines are available in clear translation of local languages, since this ultimately ensures that staff members don't make incorrect enforcement decisions. In addition, it's important to also understand that platforms have to ensure that they hire an adequate number of content reviewers who are specialized in as many languages as possible where people communicate on these platforms. This ensures a timely addressal of content which may have been flagged through internal or external sources. However, it's important to realize that simply hiring more content moderators isn't enough. Platforms should really aim to minimize the risk of incorrect content moderation decisions, and this can be solved if platforms pledge to invest more resources to train these content moderators. And in this regard, it's really important to consider that there are various factors which could affect the effectiveness of these content reviewers. I've seen, for instance, how research showed how content moderators often work under incredibly stressful working conditions, which has had an impact on the effectiveness of these content moderation operations. Moving forward, in terms of the deployment of automated tools in content moderation, my case studies, which I used in the research paper, demonstrated that while AI tools can be useful in content moderation, they cannot be relied on as the sole solution to content moderation. So steps that improve these AI tools are welcome, but social media platforms have to focus on actual human content reviewers. This brings me to the end of my research presentation today. Thank you all very much. And in case you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating to hear about how content moderation has played out or not played out across the world, whether it's Myanmar, Ethiopia, or in Punjab as well. So I just had like one or two questions regarding your research and sort of, especially the recommendations part that you put forth, because I think in many
Yeah.
ways, faults of content moderation have been discussed, but the recommendations is really where, the active policy change lies. And the first thing I actually wanted to talk about, especially when you brought up the Ethiopia example, was actually the mental health consequences of content moderation. We'd actually seen a report from Time, I think last year or this year, where they
Right.
spoke about content moderators in Kenya were going through really like troves of violent material every day, trying to determine whether it's, harmful or not, whether it violates Facebook's policies or not. They had a tough time and they also felt that they were being underpaid. So, I mean, I'm just sort of interested in understanding when you sort of view these issues, how do you view the mental health question? How do you view the employee sort of protection question when you're talking about onboarding more people, especially in very sensitive contexts like India as well?
Right. So that's actually a very, very interesting question. While it's important to understand that my research did focus on the role which local and lesser spoken languages play in content moderation, during the research I did come across studies which highlighted some of these issues. Of course, we've spoken earlier about the scale at which content moderation operations are carried out, right? And in many of these instances, we've seen how platforms, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, a lot of them are increasingly relying on third party entities to moderate content, right? And when we look at some of these instances, we see that um, the conditions in which these third party entities operate, because of course they're contractors, so it's important, we've kind of noticed how the conditions in which content reviewers in these third party entities, they often work under incredibly stressful environments. We've seen lots of studies, like I've seen studies during the course of the research, which had noted that these content reviewers often come across violent and graphic content, and this happens on a daily basis and throughout the course of their working schedule, right? And these studies have often noted that because of the nature of the content which they review on a day-to-day basis, uh, what's this has often led to post-traumatic stress disorder type of symptoms on content moderators. So it's important for social media platforms to really try and solve some of these issues. And of course, this links to some of the recommendations which I lined out in my recommendations. One of the ways which we could try and improve on these conditions is, of course, the first and most important thing is by increasing transparency. When we don't understand the conditions under which these content moderators are really working in, because uh, a lot of times we see that they work under non-disclosure agreements, so that often prevents whether it's investigations or members of the press. We often don't understand the extent of under the conditions they're working, right? So it's important for social media platforms to increase the transparency, so that we understand what happens in these contexts and how can we solve them. This, of course, links again to the role which governments and authorities play, because that way we can try and regulate the way they work.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And just to sort of pick up on the transparency question, you had mentioned it actually as one of the factors that ended up shaping your research, the fact that these platforms weren't particularly transparent about the content moderation issues that you were working on. So I would just be interested to know How do you feel that shaped the research that you did? And I think this is important from a methodological standpoint because so many people are interested in this topic. How do
Right.
you feel that shaped the research that you did? And if you if you had to speak to another researcher, say me, who's
Yeah.
interested in this topic, how would you tell them? What would you tell them to be prepared for? What would you tell them to think about while looking at the issue as well?
Right. Yeah, this is an important point as well. For instance, during my research, while I was looking at the extent of content moderation operations and looking into the number of languages in which these moderation operations are carried out, while we did, I did end up finding figures as to how many languages are used in content moderation operations. I had no clue or no data, primary data anywhere which had a list of which are these languages, right? So that kind of had an impact on my research, and it was incredibly difficult to come across primary data which would have helped to a large extent to understand. Okay, these are the number of languages. These are the languages. How else can social media platforms improve? So uh, I think in looking at the concern which this raises is that social media platforms really have to build on the transparency efforts. And this isn't just important for members of the public because it's important that they also understand how content is being moderated, but it's especially important for researchers who study the issues which is posed by content moderation. So without access to primary data, it's incredibly difficult for researchers to really understand the extent of the issues which we're facing. So that way, social media platforms should try and collaborate with more researchers across the globe. And it's important that this is done in a manner which is most importantly without any conditions for researchers, as well as it's important that this is done in a manner which is free from bias, right? So it's important that a social media platform doesn't sit in California and share data only with a university in the United States. A lot of times we see uh, these issues, the impact of these issues are often felt in other parts of the world where researchers won't probably have the same amount or same level of access. So it's important that social media platforms try and engage in these ways to try and increase access to primary data.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a super point and very important note to end this on because these knowledge divides end up shaping a lot of the research that I'm sure has been produced across the world on this issue. So I think a greater call for transparency is definitely the need of the hour. Thank you so much for taking out the time to do this presentation. If you're interested in contacting Jade, please do reach out to him on Twitter or over email to learn more about his work. Thank you.
Thank you.